I just want to welcome you at the second event for 2018 of our Digital Diplomacy series. I want to welcome also those watching our live streams on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Please feel free to post on social media using hashtag @digitaldiplomacy. Today's panel's discussion shows how here at the Embassy we see digital diplomacy as a link between traditional diplomacy and the digital age. Blockchain is today one of the most discussed topics in technology, but rarely in government. We understand how distributed ledgers and blockchain-based technologies can really become useful tools for us, including for diplomacy and foreign policy. It is an area in which innovation needs to be complemented not only by technology, but also by public-private partnerships. We talked about the importance of partnership before in our digital diplomacy series, and I'm sure the topic will emerge again today. Our panel today brings together different experiences in both government and the private sector, in technology as well as innovation. I would like to take a moment to thank Victoria Adams, Anil John, and Thomas Debass, and of course our moderator, Cara LaPointe, for being here with us this evening. Cara has spent her entire career focused on the intersection of leadership, technology, policy, and ethics. She joined the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University in June 2017. She was previously at the White House as interim director of the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. She spent over 2 decades in the US Navy, most recently serving as the hand-selected Chief of Staff of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Unmanned Systems. With that, Cara, I give you the floor, and welcome again, everybody, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited that everybody can be here tonight for this exciting discussion. Now, I will say, if you were coming today to figure out what cryptocurrency you should invest in or how cryptocurrency works, then you're not in the right discussion. We're actually going to be talking more about blockchain, the technology, and how it can be used really as a tool for government, especially in the foreign policy arena. So I would be remiss if I didn't say use hashtag digital diplomacy if you want to use social media tonight to talk about our conversation is being streamed. So I think you'll be able to find it afterwards. So what we'll do is we'll go through, I'll introduce the speakers, we'll do a little bit of moderated Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So we will have people with roving microphones. So when we get to that point, just make sure you raise your hand, you can get a microphone. So without further ado, I will say we are very lucky to have these 3 speakers with us. I will start with Anil John, who is an R&D program manager at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in their Science and Technology Directorate, which is the science advisor and the R&D arm of the DHS. So his R&D portfolio includes identity, credential and access management, privacy, IoT security, blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, as well as other relevant cybersecurity areas. We also have Dr. Victoria Adams. So Tori is one of the world's leading experts on blockchain in the public sector and how governments can leverage blockchain to transform service delivery and increase efficacy and accountability. She currently leads the US government practice of ConsenSys, which is the world's largest blockchain firm, and she specializes in the area of public finance regulation and the tokenization of assets. And finally, we have Thomas Debass with us here today, Debass, who serves as the acting special representative for global partnerships at the US Department of State. So Thomas is responsible for leading private sector engagement for the department, as well as providing thought leadership on partnerships related to economic growth, global finance, entrepreneurship, and innovation. So thank you all for being here. And I did want to start off, we always in an audience like this get kind of different levels of understanding of what blockchain is as a technology. So I'm going to go through all 3 of you and ask you just kind of a baselining question for us in terms of if you can explain a little bit about blockchain and especially in your work, what it looks like, what it means, and how you use it. And then also what you see as kind of the key opportunities and challenges. And we'll do it briefly because we'll get into this more in questions, but I figured it would be a good baseline to start off. So Anil, if you would like to start.
Sure. I was explicitly told to make sure that I pressed the button so that everybody could hear, right? So hopefully everybody can hear. And I noticed that our fellow panelists are prepared with water, and unfortunately I'm not. As mentioned, my job within the DHS Science and Technology Directorate is twofold: science technical advisor to the department itself, as well as the R&D arm. So from that perspective, for us, blockchain exploration started about 2 or 3 years ago, and that was focused on understanding the privacy and security implications of blockchain itself and what is needed within the blockchain and distributed ledger environment in order to support the DHS use cases themselves. So a lot of the effort in there was not jumping right into proof of concepts or pilots, but understanding what are the missing pieces that still exist, what needs to be filled in, what is still obscured by the globally bright and shiny object that is the blockchain and hype right now. So that is where my focus has been, and we're now moving into applying that for proof of concepts as well as filling in those gaps, and we can talk about that as we get to that as well.
I pressed the button. Apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a rather bad cold, so if you see me sucking cough sweets all night long. So I come from ConsenSys. ConsenSys is a design studio. We develop the Ethereum infrastructure, and we also develop products and services around Ethereum. And how I play into this is about a year ago, Joe Lubin, our founder, one of the original founding team for Ethereum, said to me, why don't you start an office in DC and see if there is a government market? And why don't you try and take it and push beyond the conventional use cases that are out there for government? So when we talk to government folks, and I see many of them there sitting in the front row, we talk about supply chain and we talk about identity. But we're very interested in seeing if we can go beyond that. If there are ways that we can create technologies that will improve operations, will improve government-to-government relations, and will improve government-to-citizen relations. And how can we start to conceptualize this new idea of a crypto-contractual government, where we can use blockchain to make the social contract manifest within actual smart contracts, where we can use blockchain to create treaties that are actually self-enforcing in themselves. So we've been doing a lot of work, both paying the bills by doing the use cases around supply chain, around identity, but also seeing if we can take it a step further and push blockchain into some of those areas where we can use its unique capabilities of accountability, of transparency, and of its vital truth-preserving characteristics. If it is true here, it is true later. And how can we apply that to all of the work of government and its many diverse relationships with citizens and other governments?
Thanks, Tori. And I look forward to getting into how we can push blockchain in a little bit. But first, Thomas.
So I'm at the Department of State, and I help manage a relatively small office called the Office of Global Partnerships. And its essentially mandate is to look for ideas, resources, and networks outside of the department in advancing our foreign policy. As you all probably recognize, the world has shifted very dramatically the last 20 years, where the idea that governments alone can solve global challenges is no longer the case. It's actually predominantly driven by the private sector. So with that realization, we have been working on looking at issues that the private sector is leading, in some cases trailblazing. And the last 2 years, we've been looking at blockchain as one emerging technology that is essentially disrupting the world or kind of creating new waves of change. And what this technology could do, aside from all the use cases that we're going to hear today, is also the dynamic of relationship between government and the private sector, right? At least the promised land that blockchain has been talking about will essentially shift both the power structure and relationships that sovereign entities will have with their citizenship and what have you. So we're also looking at that. And so it is with that lens, but with specifically on partnership ideas, where how could this technology could help collaborate between the private sector and the public sector, not just within the US government, even around the world. So we're looking at it both internally facing from the Department of State and also from our foreign affairs engagement point of view around the world. So that is the lens that we've come at our interest in blockchain comes from.
Perfect. And we'll jump into the partnerships in a little bit. Anil, I'd like to go back to you. You talked a little bit about, we're in this hype cycle with blockchain, that there's a lot of talk out there in terms of how it's going to transform the world. So I'd like to hear from you a little bit. What do you see as the true potential? What are the key characteristics that lead to its real potential? And what are some of those use cases where the real potential lies?
So it's interesting to me that I was so as you may or may not know, part of the DHS remit is in our customs and border protection side of it. So the customs side is as old as America. They've been, for those who are not familiar with it, the US government, I think, was funded using customs duties at least until the 1920s. So they're one of the oldest parts of the government. And they're actually turns out to be one of the ones who are leaning forward the most in exploring the applicability of distributed ledger or blockchain technologies to how improving trade and facilitating the enforcement and the facilitation of trade, right? So I was at a CBP conference and I was asked by an importer, what is a blockchain? And can you explain it to me? And I sort of went down this technical bit of, it is a peer-to-peer ledger that uses specific protocols to synchronize the data. And I could see the eyes sort of glaze over as I was doing this technical dump on it. So I had to go back and try to figure out what was something that I could convey to people that explained the fundamentals of what blockchain is, and at the same time did not lose fidelity with what the technical people might describe it as. So forgive me as I refer to the actual note so that I get the pieces right. So from our perspective, we consider blockchain to be an authoritative book of records where there are many copies that are kept synchronized, in which multiple parties can create individual records, but there is some sort of a consensus mechanism that is used to determine the order and the validity of those records. And each record obviously is linked to the prior one, and any changes to those records is immediately visible to anybody who has access to that book. It sort of avoids all of the things about hash chains and proof of work and proof of stake and all that kind of stuff that sort of gets into that piece. Now, within that particular context, what is our interest and what is our use case? As I mentioned, we did not start out from the use case perspective. I am an R&D shop first and foremost, but I am not a basic research R&D shop. I am an R&D shop that is in service to my operational components who have specific missions, whether it is on the trade side, whether it is on the passenger facilitation side. So our interest was, again, from the security and privacy perspective, everybody is familiar with the security principles such as confidentiality, integrity, availability, privacy principles such as pseudonymity, selective disclosure of information. Our interest 2.5, 3 years ago was lots of frothy conversation about blockchain, but does any of the blockchain implementations or distributed ledger implementations out there actually support that fundamental constructs that have stood the test of time? That was our starting point, and significant amount of lessons learned that we will talk about. But the long and the short of it is, we discovered that there was some promise, but there was also some things that were missing, and we're filling in those missing pieces right now, and we're applying it to our particular use cases. Within the broader DHS context, there are 4 so far. I'm sure there are more that will come out of the woodwork. One of them is around the fact that we have a lot of sensor platforms, we have a lot of IoT devices. The ability to have confidence that the integrity of the data that is coming off the devices is critically important to us, right? So, and we've done a proof of concept with our border patrol with a company called Factum to move down that path, and we can talk about that later. The other use case that we have is around the passenger facilitation, not domestic passenger facilitation, but international passenger facilitation, whereby if you've ever been to Canada or to Dublin or other countries where we have a pre-clearance airport, which is where you clear American customs in a foreign airport so that you are actually landing in a domestic terminal, you will notice that you hit multiple checkpoints as part of it. Airlines, their equivalent of TSA, the country might have a host exit, then there is the actual CBP's Federal Inspection Service, then the jetway. Is there a way to streamline that process? Is there a way to ensure that all the checks have been done in a particular order, in a particular sequence, so that by the time you get to the jetway, you have full confidence that everything has been done, and there is an increasing level of confidence in both the identity of the person and that the checks have been done? That is another use case that we are moving out on right now, and proof of concept that we're moving out right now. The third one, as I said, is very much in our trade area. Fascinating set of people, right? So, because I'm not a trade person, but we did a significant amount of workshops with them, and there are cases that there are 3 or 4 primary use cases that teed up from there around origin of goods, around some interesting thing called a carnet. I never knew what that was, but the best explanation I was given was, you are a rock band that is touring the world, right? When you come in, you are bringing in equipment that you are not living in that country, but you want to take out as well. A carnet is a temporary passport for that equipment. How do you track them? Last is sustainable and tuna fishing and origin of tuna. Again, important things to them. We're moving out on them. And last but not least is the fact that as any government or authoritative source of identity documents will tell you, currently, a lot of our breeder documents, the foundational documents on which your identity is based on, are only as strong as the cardstock and the holograms that are basically used to generate them. So great interest, especially from an identity perspective, on is there a way to anchor some of those attestations within a distributed ledger environment while still allowing the ability to do verification of that identity? Those are 4 use cases, broad ones, and active work that we're doing in that particular area.
Thank you. I think those are great examples of very concrete use cases of blockchain that people can relate to. Now, Tori, I did want to switch to you a little bit. I know you alluded to it earlier, and you think a lot about how blockchain is not just going to provide kind of these concrete use cases for the way things work right now, but actually create sweeping change, especially kind of in the ways that people interact with the government. So I wonder if you can take us to kind of that strategic level and talk a little bit about your vision and what you see blockchain being able to do.
Sure. So when we started to think about blockchain and government, we tried to go back to first principles and say, what fundamentally is a government and what does a government do? And one of the things that we honed in is a government is essentially data, information, and a set of rules. It's about information, who has it, who doesn't have it, having to give information to people and having to provide information. And it's about the rules, who shall have it. Now, these are 2 things that blockchain can manage very well. In industrial society and early digital society in the late 20th century, what we saw was technology pushed towards centralized control and centralization. What we're starting to see now is the technologies are coming into being where we can push towards decentralization, towards greater autonomy and control of my own data assets and of the data assets of firms, of organizations, of sub-governments, of everything you can think of. Now, within that environment, as it's starting to emerge, you're going to see new rules that are coming in. We started to develop a product called Open Law, where we were looking to see, could we put law onto the blockchain? What would that look like? Could we put a treaty onto the blockchain? Could we use the validation methods of the blockchain and the identity measurements of the blockchain and see if that treaty could become almost self-executing when it came to IoT devices and other things? And then we thought, well, that's interesting. We found a few treaties. We worked with some Chilean free trade treaties, and we got them in because they went, because trade is nice, it's easy, it's conceptual, and all of this. And then we started to think, well, could you take this further? Where could this go? And you start to come up pretty quickly to some fundamental questions about the relationship of citizens and their government. Is this a technology that empowers the citizen or empowers the government? Are we going to see a situation where more and more I contract for the delivery of services? And is the government the best provider of many of those services when we come to public and private? Here, is blockchain opening up those capabilities where, for instance, when it comes to funding. One of the things we're working on now is this idea of tokenizing assets for sale, tokenizing things in public-private partnerships. So, for instance, if I want to fund a small electrical charging station in the US right now, it's very difficult to do. It's about $60,000 for a street charging station. If my voters won't do it in a municipality, it's too small for a bond. But I could do it by selling tokens. I could sell them to the community for $5 a pop, and I could use that token as a utility token where they could charge it, and also for its tax benefit. And further than that, I could even start giving tokens to people. So I could get around, say, the opposition of people that drive gasoline cars in my community by saying, I'm going to give everybody 3 tokens. Now, they could buy an electric vehicle, or they could start to trade them. I can create all these microeconomies and new situations, new relationships between people that are really starting to change that. Think of that with diaspora bonds too, where people in the developed world might want to give to, their same community in the less developed world. That's really interesting. Think about it when my identity is detached from territoriality, where I have an identity that is more value in terms of the world than my passport is. My passport might get me into countries, but my Visa card decides where I can stay when I can get there and where I can go. Imagine if my blockchain identity was as solid as that, to say, I'm worth it, I've got the money, but also, I am somebody with a certain degree of security that you can trust to do things. These are very interesting ideas as we start to go along. And as you start to think of the potential then of public sector organizations to begin to deliver across borders and to be able to move away from that. Imagine, for instance, if we reach a point where rather than, say, school districts being tied to territoriality, they get tied to a certain way of delivering education. Where I say, actually, Seattle's really good at delivering education. I prefer Seattle deliver education in my city of Washington than do it in Seattle. And being able to contract to that independent of a government to deliver. Imagine if we could start to build identities in conflict zones. I mean, we've talked before for the State Department folks about Colombia. Folks coming out with the FARC who have no identity, who now we can give an identity to using blockchain that can then attest to things. And in this situation, with a self-sovereign identity, or as we prefer to call it, a citizen-managed identity, where the citizen can be in a position to say, I will give you this information, but not other information. So for instance, I always liken it to the bouncer when you go to a club, and the bouncer asks to see your ID. And you give your ID. Now, all they want to see is that you're over 21, but they also get your address, your weight, your height, your eye color, all this. Now, what blockchain enables you to do with that citizen-managed identity is just to say, yes, this person's over 21. Yes, this person meets this. You don't need to see my other data. Now, in a place where I don't trust the government, in a post-conflict situation, that might be very handy. Hell, it might be very handy for a DACA kid who's trying to get an education in California nowadays. Yes, I am a resident of the state of California, but you don't need to know my immigration status. So in a way, blockchain is sort of carving out this new private space for individuals, for citizens, to create a new space protected from government. And that's going to shift power that will inevitably occur from centralized governmental authorities into individual things. Now, I'm not a crazy anarchist like many people in my company. We have a chief anarchy office. I always say it's a sad comment when I am the voice of sanity in a group. But my colleagues would say this is the end of centralized government in a few decades. We're going to move to affinities and syndicates and all of this. And I would say, no. But it's going to shift the balance. It's going to put more power back into the individual. The key question is, do we want it? Will we manage it? Yeah, Facebook gives us all those options to control our privacy, but most of us click through so we can, play Angry Birds. We'll give up our privacy for, a heap of pottage. So the question is, blockchain enables the individual, but is the individual ready for that kind of autonomy and power? And I think it's a real question.
Well, I think that's great. I think you gave us a lot to think about, Tori. So in the context of these examples that Anil has given us of really concrete tools that blockchain can play for the government, and in terms of what Tori's talking about, how it's really going to change these relationships of how individuals interact with organizations and specifically the government. Thomas, I want to turn to you, and let's think about these in terms of the context of foreign policy in particular. What do you see the applications of some of these tools and how these changing relationships will play out in the foreign policy arena?
I mean, I think based on Tori's outlook, we might be going bankrupt. So that's the immediate outlook I'll give you. But jokes aside, though, Tori's point is well taken in a sense of what this could look like, right? And I think one of the exciting thing, at least in my job and our job in the partnerships office, is exploring future thinking, foresight, and about what blockchain will do now, but the kind of the emerging things that it will do 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Because some of the comparison I've heard about blockchain is where the internet was in 1998, 97, 98. And imagine now what we know now, for the type of industries that come out, the type of jobs that have been created, the type of industries that have been appended. And I think that's the scenario that we're interested in looking at, right? And I think is within that context, obviously, our interest in blockchain comes in. There are two issues. One is obviously the department, as any other government agency, including DHS, is interested in doing its job more efficiently, more effectively, and all that other jazz that come with that. And blockchain could be a tool to that. And I think my colleague Anil already talked about, we have some overlap in terms of customs and us with passports and visas and what have you. And I think there are different use cases you could talk about. The other element of it, as an emerging technology, blockchain, for the US to maintain and excel its competitive advantage around the world and innovations and things like that, we also have to look at the blockchain as a competitive advantage for us, creating new economic growth, security, and what have you. So when you look at that two issues, then everything else makes sense and why we look at those things. And I think some of the doomsday scenario, or if you're an arcanist, if you're the type of folks that Tori would work with, whether they're realistic or not, we cannot ignore the fact what this technology's potential is. And our job is to see, do we want that? And the other thing is, what are the benefit costs of how a technology would decentralization brings to the equation. So from a foreign policy point of view, one is on foreign assistance, right? We deploy significant amount of resources, at least in the emerging markets and developing countries, putting U.S. taxpayers' money and providing humanitarian assistance and economic growth and all these type of programming. And there is significant amount of spillage that happens with that, whether it's corruption and efficiency and allocation issues. And could blockchain help address the inefficiencies issues to ensure that the type of resources that we deploy go to the right targets, right population, the right objectives that we have. I think that's from a foreign policy point of view, from a foreign assistance point of view, that's one thing. The other thing is, if the kind of the pro side of blockchain gets deployed in some of these markets, what are the policy dynamic, the internal policy dynamic that happens, and how does that affect our foreign policy? And I think that's another issue that we can look at. The other element of it is also, what are the new industries that will come out of that? That vis-a-vis in terms of US jobs that will be created and industries that will come out, and what are the new trading blocks and investment blocks that would come out of that? It's just imagine, I'll go back to the 1998 internet to what we are right now, and none of you suffer from poverty of imagination. So what that would look like 5 years from now. And in our case, at least the evolution that I've seen in the last 2.5 years that I've been following it has been leaps in terms of the growth. So I don't think we're going to be looking at 20 years from now. We might be looking at next year or 5 years. So these are the kind of, these issues that I talked about, there is intimate interconnection in their ability to disrupt the positive things that are happening and also the inefficiencies that are happening in the marketplace. So that's where our foreign policy interest comes in, especially on the emerging technology side, because it's not just blockchain. There are other technologies that are coming out. But blockchain, right now, there's a lot of rave about it, to the point where it has become, in my opinion, a verb. Blockchain, it has just become so much of a buzz, and which is a good thing in a sense. But there are the good and the bad, the ugly when it comes to blockchain. Now, like, not everything that happens in blockchain could be an application for it. There are sometimes you just can use Oracle database to do that. Why would you want to go through that kind of process? So there has to be a little bit of sanity check, so we don't get overboard and create an unnecessary excitement about something that might not be there. But there is clearly a private sector pulse that is leading that effort. And our job, at least from my point of view, from our office point of view, is if the private sector is leading that effort, we do not want to be 10 years behind and catching up what this can look like and how we could deploy it around the world. So that's kind of my outlook, what that would look like from a foreign policy point of view.
Yeah, no, I think that point about the challenge of governing emerging technologies with the rapid pace of development is really well taken. And I will say, I also have started to use blockchain as a verb, to blockchain or not to blockchain. And on that, I'm actually going to pivot a little bit and maybe look back to Tori and say, okay, when is it really appropriate to use blockchain, and when might it not be appropriate? In what scenarios?
We spend a lot of time with this when clients come to us and say, we want to blockchain something. And normally we say, yeah, then we're not interested. But if you've got a problem where you got a problem, now let's talk about whether blockchain is going to work for that. And the key thing with that is, do you have a number of parties that are in this who have some degree of trust? That lack that trust, rather, that have some need to be able to share information, but their interests might lead them away from being able to do it. It's one reason in our token foundry group, which sort of manages the ICOs and token releases, we have a whole bunch of game theorists, because this sort of fundamentally gets down to this. If you've got a hegemon within a situation who wants to have a blockchain, we say you really need a centralized database. If you're going to force people, we say go to IBM in that case. That's a little dig there. I mean, with Walmart and IBM, what they're fundamentally doing is Walmart, as a monopolist that can set the price, is turning to its suppliers and saying, we're going to put it on the blockchain so we can trust you. But that's unnecessary. They're setting the price. They're controlling everything along the way. They're just doing it to make it look good, right? To make people feel good. Now, if you've got a situation where we were talking the other day about, say, the e-manifest program in the government, where you have a hazardous waste shipping problem that has to move around the country, and you've got 3 or 4 big firms that dominate this industry, but none of them trust one another. They can't get into the room because they all have trade secrets. So they want a way of having a supply chain that can be verified, but they can keep their secret source. Now that's a good solution, where you have that degree of absence of trust, but a need to trust that's going in. As the same thing with a lot of the trade things you were talking about,
I think that's great. And so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So have your questions prepared. Be ready. So Anil, I'm going to look to you and talk about something that I think Thomas touched on a little bit, in the sense of industry is really pushing forward, and kind of the governance piece is lagging a little bit. But there's another issue that we have in terms of this interoperability, because there are a lot of these unique solutions that are being developed kind of in the blockchain space. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of lessons learned about trying to operate in that environment and maybe kind of drive standards around this, so that we can get to the point where blockchains may be interoperable?
Certainly. I'll also note that I did not expect to agree with Tori, but I actually do agree on the fundamental, when a blockchain use case is actually valid. It is when there are multiple parties, and no one party wants anybody else to be the central authority or the entity that has the infrastructure where everything else is written. So, which also means that 80 to 90% of the use cases that are thrown out for blockchain has nothing to do with the blockchain, right? So, to your point, I mean, I'll simply note that the answer to your question is based on the work that we've done to date and the gaps that we've encountered within that particular space. And I'll give a point counterpoint for each of the standards questions. And I'll also note that standards is a wrong term to use at this stage of the game. Standardization is an incredibly painful and long process. So you sort of start out with specifications that go through a standardization process to become a standard through a multi-stakeholder open process, right? So I think it's more apt to talk about what are the potential specifications that are out there that enable interoperability. So lessons learned from our experience. First and foremost was basically, majority of the people who want a blockchain don't need a blockchain. So, and we have I'm sure that just like Tori has, we have a heuristic that we sort of use in order to determine how that is. And it's public, we made that public before. The other piece of it is, in the race to market share, people seem to have thrown out architecture and design out the window and trying to throw technology at this. So I've been around long enough that I went through the internet bubble. I went through the service-oriented architecture bubble. I went through the cloud bubble. And I would simply note that the same conversations and the topics and the enthusiasm and the language, I heard that back then as well. Now, the interesting thing that you sort of need to think about is, out of all of those things, something was left at the end in how we designed and delivered and deployed software. So the questions that we are asking ourselves through our proof of concepts, through our R&D is, what will be left at the end of the blockchain hype cycle, right? Don't know the answer yet, but I will simply note that blockchain has definitely made Napster sexy, right? Back in the day, right? So peer-to-peer protocols were not something that enterprises would ever permit on the network. Now, oh my God, let's deploy multiple blockchain nodes, peer-to-peer synchronization all over the place. Not a problem at all, right? So fascinating. But design and architecture. But some of the challenges here, every single blockchain vendor out there, it doesn't matter whether it is permissioned, whether it is public or not, the data model that they use in order to put data on the ledger, ledger implies syntax and semantics, is proprietary to them. There is no interoperability at the data level in what you are writing on the chain, which means that in the race to gain market share and first mover advantage, they're locking you into their platform. So how do you sort of address that? And one of the ways is basically through specifications such as verifiable claims data model that is going out through the W3C that is looking at JSON LD structures that can basically provide you interoperability at the data level. The other piece of it is, from our perspective, we also discovered specific anti-patterns that you should never use. For example, I live in dread of the two words, biometrics and blockchain, being used in the same conversation, right? So one should never, ever design a system that puts private, PII, or sensitive data on the chain itself. Think about it from the perspective of, there's a lot of people who are saying, it's okay to put the data on the chain because you can use encryption to protect it. Now, given the fact that encryption ciphers have a time to live, whether it is because of Moore's law or whether it's because of implementation challenges, sooner or later, that encryption cipher will be broken. You combine that with a long-lived ledger and bad things happen in combination, right? So you want to design systems such that you never put data on the chain. If you're putting data that is sensitive, make sure that you have pointers from the chain to off-chain sources that you can protect using defensive techniques. But the challenge there is, if you're providing pointers, if you want those pointers to be interoperable and read across multiple implementations, you got to have some specifications and standards around it. Decentralized identifiers, which are moving out through the W3C, are a way to address that and provide that in a manner. As an identity management person, I'll simply note that distributed key management, the provisioning of public-private key pairs that end up in a blockchain wallet, the revocation if that is lost, the reissuance of it, it is not a solved problem. It has been a continued hard problem in this field for a long while. And blockchain vendors hand wave over it or paper over it by mapping in proprietary technologies on top of it. So decentralized distributed key management and solutions to that are a problem that does need to be addressed. It's also something that we've invested in. One of the companies that we have been working with and funding has been Evanim. They've basically, I think just yesterday, deployed an architecture and design into the Hyperledger Indy code base, free, open source. People can take a look at it, use it, provide feedback and comments so that there is at least one way. Is it the way? No. I think there are multiple ways. But in general, around the standardization and interoperability, if you want a competitive ecosystem as an organization, if you do not want to be locked into a particular vendor, decentralized identifiers so that you have pointers to data off the chain so that you can actually not put sensitive data, verifiable claims data model so that you have a common way of representing data, and last, decentralized key management would be the pieces that I would say need a lot more emphasis, a lot more energy around, and they are currently moving out through the standards organization. And if you are interested in that, that is something that you should absolutely be tracking. I know that that is something that we are putting, we're championing a lot of that simply because, like any large enterprise, we do not want to be in a position where we're locked into a corner and dependent on one vendor for any solution.
I think that's really important. So I would like to give time for the audience. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? We have one up front. We have the microphone.
Anil, is this on? Okay, Anil, can you address the data hack in 2015 that took probably your data, but definitely I know mine went because I was in that security level to China. So as you were saying, you don't want to lock things into the block because eventually they could become vulnerable. But there we had OPM with the IBC hosting, and our data was lost quite considerable and very personal. Before you address this, I actually do believe that we have many, many identities, and many identities that we do, none of which we control the data on. And those identities are gathered everywhere from when you or I walk in the same mall over and over and over again, and the little billboard, electronic billboard, captures our image looking at whatever it's showing and capturing how much time we look at it, and eventually it does facial recognition where it can actually measure us to figure out that we were in the shop and use a credit card. So I think we don't control our identities, and they're in many places right now that we can't even count.
So I am unsure about what the question is, right? So
what is different?
If you can use the.
What is different from what already has been or is? Because your identity and mine, we were both at GSA in 2015. I assume you also have a top secret security clearance then. Our data went to China. And I don't see why I should be afraid of my data locked with a SHA-256 compared to how it was handled before. And the difference now proposed from what I heard from Tori is that you may have actual control of your data where before we had no control. What I was saying in my statement in the second part is that there's many identities that exist for us that we have no control of.
So I will address it from one particular aspect, right? One of them is the fact that, as I mentioned, some of the lessons learned from our proof of concept has particularly been around the fact that blockchain and blockchains in general should never be used to store private, sensitive type of data. So I don't want to. So if OPM were to ask me whether they should be converting their existing systems to a blockchain-based environment to store some sort of a data, my answer would be to run screaming, in the other direction as fast as I could, right? So that is not a path to success. which is precisely why my point before has been there needs to be thoughtful design and architecture that is applied to any system. And it's not just blockchain-based systems in ensuring that the data that you need to protect is actually kept in a place and protected using a defense in the strategy. Blockchain is not the be-all and the end-all solution for anything like that. And from my perspective, it is not the appropriate place to store any type of long-lived, sensitive, or PII data.
Back here, and then can we also get a microphone back there for the next question?
Hi, I was just hoping for the entire group if you guys could talk a little bit about the use of blockchain for voting or elections.
Okay, Thomas, you want to lead that?
I don't know if I want to lead on that, but I would say there was a recent news about Sierra Leone, and then it came back to be not a credible, true thing. But there is a certain level of promise when with blockchain and how it could, especially in the emerging markets where electronic voting and things like that are not existing, and fraud seem to be quite prominent in these places. Technology like blockchain could address that. But it's hard for me to comment on that without having a specific example. Like I wish the Sierra Leone thing was real, that we can kind of see what happened on that one. But there is actually a promise for it. But I think it remains to be seen what that would look like. And the other element of it is voting on its own, aside from the technology element of it, is a very complicated, very political, very partisan issue around the world, not just in the US. So I would imagine, I don't know if that is the best use cases to actually start with, to show the promise of blockchain. But I'm hoping that there will be forward-looking countries, or in some cases, I've heard about something in Seattle or Washington.
Yeah.
Certain municipalities trying to do that, right?
Yeah, and I think voting actually shows a lot of what Anil was just saying. The actual thing of putting your vote onto a blockchain is not a complicated thing. There's a number of companies that have been talking about this, and especially after we see Russian hacking and everything, we see Russian. But hacking, by the president's friends, let's just say it that way. That's increased the idea of if we had this secure technology to be able to identify, to be able to, keep track of what your vote was and to preserve the identity of it. But is that really the problem? I mean, we've got to think of the entire context of voting, of the voting machine, of where I'm storing the data, of what my identity is, how I keep track of the keys to that, as you've just been saying. It's rather like saying I'm going to put a $500 lock on a door and I'm going to screw it into place with 2-cent screws, right? Unless the entire system is reconceptualized around a more secure way of managing votes, and to some degree a more centralized system. It might have decentralized elements. In this country, we, of course, don't have a centralized voting system, and all kinds of problems come from that. But I think it's a much more complex question than voting on it when it comes to protecting the vote. Now, if you have countries like Sierra Leone, where you're just looking for an honest count, I would say there are probably easier ways to do it, but it's definitely something you could do.
Thank you. And also, I would lead you to West Virginia just launched a limited pilot with overseas active duty military folks. So that's another thing to look into.
So I'll simply note that I think I'd rather learn the lessons from other people who want to bleed on the edge rather than be bleeding edge on this one.
Spoken like a government. But responsible government.
Well said. Well said, Anil. Well said.
No, that's a piece, right? I mean, for us, I think government ends up being, we don't have the luxury of pivoting away from a customer base because it's not profitable, it doesn't meet our needs. So from that perspective, there is a significant amount of responsibility and care that needs to be taken in deploying a technology because it has a pretty high bar. And to me, there is still steps to reach that high bar in this area. So.
Great. And then we had a question back in the corner.
My question was, what would your definition of blockchain be to someone who has just woken up out of a coma from 1998 and the last computer they used was a Macintosh?
Tori, you want to take that one?
I think about that a lot, actually, because I try and explain that to my dad, who keeps asking me about the price of Bitcoin. I go from 2 points. I go from two levels on that. One is to say to people, don't worry about it. Do you know how your phone works? I haven't the faintest idea how my phone works. It just makes calls for me. So we're almost talking here not about the phone, but about how TCP works, how the internet works. We don't need to do that to know how to work it. So on one hand, I just want to say, don't worry about it. Just look at the apps that are delivered on it. Look at the services that are delivered. As those come, you like those? Great. You don't need to understand how the internet works to be able to book a flight online. You just need to know that it works. So that's one level. On another level, I feel it's in the air, so you got to answer it. I like the idea of it's a truth-preserving machine. That if something was true in one point, it's going to be true in another point. And if you don't trust people, that truth-preserving activity is a really important thing to do. I think conceptually, that's really what it does. It allows you to share information that you are worried about between people you don't trust. That's a pretty good thing.
We have a question up here in the front.
Thank you. Yeah, much of the discussion about blockchain is also about, I guess, the agency of the individual. That now we're empowering an individual with the truth about their identity or some way of acting independently of a government. But whether it's with regard to entering a foreign state or having that agency, perhaps it's not the integrity or the truth of the information itself, but who is backing that information, who is backing the individual, so that using blockchain rather than a government-issued passport as an identity document, wouldn't that be similar to somebody trying to travel with a fantasy passport saying, I don't need the state to guarantee my identity. I have something which is better than that. And we can imagine what a state will say when that person crosses the border. So, I mean, the question is, or tries to cross the border. You could probably answer that. So, the question is it really a matter of the integrity of the data, or to ask your anarchist friends, is it that that this needs to be something which is backed by a state, and that without that, it doesn't matter whether the data is true or false?
I think that's the critical question, because what is a passport? But it's a document with attestations attached to it. That there is a government attesting to this person's identity. The promise of blockchain is to be able to generate alternative attestations. Right now, I don't see that happening. I think that's very complicated. But on the other hand, who knows? I wouldn't have thought digital money would have worked 10 years ago. But we've now got digital gold in the shape of Bitcoin. And it does seem to be a store of value that works in some way. And that's not backed by the government. So maybe something will happen. I would say this. I have an identity card from Nicaragua from a time when the regime that issued me that no longer exists. But I bet people in some parts of the world would think that's more reliable than looking at my Facebook friends and IMing them and saying, is this person who it is? The official document gives you the gloss of some kind of identity, but we may be moving to a point where things like social media and more decentralized ideas of identity are more reliable ways of determining who we are. So I agree with you right now, but I would say going into the future, we might be seeing attestations that are more reliable or as reliable as governments. Now, those attestations don't have the pleasure of the Seventh Fleet or the power of the United States, which essentially allows you to travel freely throughout the world. But perhaps banks might. Others kind of monetary resources. Now, is that a better world? I don't know.
But I think the other thing is, it's not kind of a zero-sum game, right? I mean, I think the attestation that Troy is talking about, this is where I was coming at from the collaboration point of view. Could blockchain help us enhance government's attestation of that identity? It's operability and interoperability between countries, right? So I don't think it is in a sense of saying blockchain will displace the government. Essentially, could it help the government deploy and provide the services that it's made for in a better, efficient way? Is probably the conversation that we're going at, rather than there will be this kind of parallel universe where a blockchain universe versus our world right now. So that's my view, but Anil might have.
No, I will not get into the social conversation around the role of government in this area, but I do have a analogy that might be useful in considering what the utility of blockchain in this particular case is. It has nothing to do with people. It has everything to do with machines. So I mentioned that one of the original use cases that we had, that we actually moved out on, was basically trying to ensure that the imagery and sensor data that were coming off of sensors and cameras were not tampered with. So, the case was basically make sure that there is a capability to, properly hash the information, and ensure that it can be validated publicly using a blockchain technology. We discovered two things as part of that effort, and this was in the early days of it. One of them was the fact that we were asking the wrong question, and second, the blockchain integrity piece was remarkably easy, right? So the wrong question that we were asking was the fact that while we were concentrating on the integrity of the data that was coming off of an element, we were neglecting the fact that what we actually wanted was anti-spoofing, right? So anti-spoofing requires you to solve two problems simultaneously. You need to have a clear understanding of the identity of the element that is generating the data, and you need to have confidence that the data that is coming off of that element has not been tampered with. Blockchain can help with the latter. It cannot help with the former. And if you try to solve only one problem, you either end up in a position where you are susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack, or you're susceptible to a swapping attack, where you can swap the device out. I would argue that the same analogy holds true within the people context as well. There is a tendency to attribute magical powers to the blockchain and what it can give you. That is not true. If you do not have good understanding and the quality of the data, if you do not have a good understanding of the identity and the process that you need to put into place to assure it, what you will end up with is an immutable chain of garbage, right? So so blockchain is a piece of a larger architecture. It is not in and of itself the entire thing. So from your perspective, from the questions that you asked regarding the identity and things like that, yes, there is a piece regarding assuring the integrity that something happened at a specific point in time, at a specific point in time. But can you be sure that that happened to the right person? Was that a real person? Or was that a synthetic identity? Those are all not blockchain problems that cannot be solved by throwing blockchain at the problem.
I think that's critical when it comes to what you're saying. Again, it's the $500 lock with the 2-cent screws. It's when we cross from the analog into the digital world, between the cup and the lip, all kinds of things can go wrong there. We did a project with Airbus, and they became very confused with the whole idea of supply chain, because they said, what do you mean about trust within the supply chain? You don't get into our supply chain unless we trust you. And we have all this data coming in, and if we trust you, we don't need this. If we don't trust you, You're not getting into the supply chain. And that, we would talk about RFID tags, and they said, hey, we figured out how you can get around those. We've seen all the scams that there are. And it really turned into this very analog world problem away from a blockchain problem very quickly.
I think that's an important point, that digitizing an analog problem does not solve that analog problem. So unfortunately, we can only take one more. I think we have a hand right here in front.
Okay, I know.
Or two, we can take two more. So.
Okay, so the more interesting challenge, even within everything we're talking about at the moment, comes down to this. Voting requires anonymity to an extent. What is being stored? How do I accomplish this? Why is, and I look at it from another perspective, one of the challenges is when you move any type of currency to the chain, any chain, does the individuals receiving it, it has to be a complete ecosystem. There's no anonymity when I go electronic. I can't be anonymous. If I walk into 7-Eleven to buy a Diet Dr. Pepper, I'm paying cash with $2. There's no way to track that. That becomes one of the challenges. Any comments of how we get around that?
So I'm glad you brought that up, simply because I do think that a lot of the identity on the blockchain is actually driven by the blockchain community and not the identity community, right? From the implementer perspective. In the identity community, there is a clear realization that there needs to be an ability to separate out the assertion of sameness, that I am the same person over and over again without knowing who I am, from the set of attestations that you can bring to the table that you can layer on top of it and bind them together in some sort of a trusted process that assigns you this is Anil who is conducting this transaction. That actually has been an incredibly hard challenge in the identity world. I'll simply note that this is one of the few areas where blockchain technology actually is providing some glimmers of hope. And I know this because I have been funding projects in that area to provide a clear separation between that attestation and the identity things. And one of the companies is that we've been working with is a company called SecureKey that currently has an initial product called Verified Me that is providing that capability whereby you can provide an attestation of sameness, but then use a blockchain-based ability to provide what they call a triple blind infrastructure, which is basically the person, exactly, right? So that is, I think, important, where it's not we're not talking about identity on the blockchain, we're talking about using a distributed ledger to solve a hard problem in identity. And I think those are some of the things that we need to look at in this new environment, whereby what does this technology enable for us, and can it solve some intractable problems that have already existed for a long time?
I just to throw in the whole thing on money. I mean, I think all of us would be very surprised if we're using physical money within 50 years. We're going to be using some form of electric money. I said that to somebody at the Mint. They said, oh no, we're going to be using physical money, and it's going to be green. We're conservative when it comes to this. But it's going to be some form of electronic money. And it's going to be some form of cryptographically protected money. And it's going to be some form of money that goes beyond I have $1,000 in my bank account and it's just $1,000 entered into a spreadsheet somewhere. It's going to be some identity associated with every unit of that money. That's going to mean that you're giving up considerable anonymity in your money. Right now, when you pay your $2, nobody knows it's you. Nobody knows which dollars you used, where you got those dollars from. That's the ultimate anonymous money. The ultimate money laundering thing is money. When I have my cryptographic money in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time, and it will come, whether it's blockchain or not, who knows? Every dollar, I will know where it was, where it came from, where it went. Comfortable with that?
So we have time for one more question. The woman in the front.
My question is about diplomacy, and because you mentioned the analog world, I think not enough was explained here. What is the role of blockchain, and is there any when it comes to diplomacy? Can we solve the Iran deal problem in that way? No, let's not go to such difficult problems, but what would that be and how?
It's me, right?
I think you wanted to finish out the evening. There you
Yeah,
go.
exactly. I mean, I think it's broader than diplomacy, and I think your framing about foreign policy is a much more better one than just diplomacy. I think I don't want to repeat myself, but the issue is that what type of future are we facing, and how does that future is going to impact our relationships around the world, right? Not just money, not just identity. I mean, every aspect of things we had a conversation with involves a sovereign nation attesting it, accepting it, and what have you, right? So it's not, we don't live in a vacuum. And when it comes to blockchain, it's essentially the blockchain saying there is no vacuum. It's all decentralized, it's all open. If you were going into that world, in that global context, and in that viewpoint, then what does a relationship look like? What does it mean to have an ally? What does that mean to have a bilateral relationship? What does that mean to be multilateral type of relationships? And in some of the kind of scenarios people are talking about, then you see relationships where cities having direct relationships with other cities rather than sovereign to sovereign. So there are different aspects of what the future could look like and what this blockchain could power as it evolves. And it would inherently impact our diplomatic relationships around the world. And I think that's where the kind of what remains to be seen. I don't have a clear picture of what that would look like, but we're at least looking at what the private sector is doing and how that would impact all of us. So that's, I think, the context that I could say how diplomacy will be impacted by blockchain, because it's not just, we're not talking about the technology somehow is going to help us talk to our Italian counterparts in Rome. That's not the issue here. But the issue is that how does this fundamentally transform how economies work? When they do change, then what does that mean to have a bilateral trade agreement when some of these transactions are happening, when some of our trade agreements are now outdated because we did not take into account how these transactions are being conducted. So these are the kind of things that I think that fundamentally change relationships, intra-government relationships, and government to private sector relationships. And I think that's where the potential impact of blockchain will be.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there. If the promise of blockchain can be delivered on, and I agree, it's an if. What blockchain fundamentally allows the possibility of when it comes to diplomacy is the ability to make agreements with another party without the existence of a sovereign. And that is quite profound. So if I can make an agreement with another party in another country to do something, and I do not require necessarily the legal system of either country or any international regime to do that, and then can enforce it in some manner via the blockchain, that is a very powerful thing, where you can see city to city, you can see person to person, you can see affinity to affinity. Where one group in a country might say, I have more in common with somebody 3,000 miles away than I do with the people 3 miles away. Think of it for the LGBTQ community. They might say, I am more concerned about what queer people are doing in Iran than I am concerned about somebody who's the same citizenship in my own country that does not fall into my affinity. And I wish to transfer resources, to transfer things to them, and to make agreements with them. Now, this technology and plenty of other technologies are pushing us towards the ability to do this. But this unique thing of being able to make agreements without a sovereign is a very profound change. Now, will people act on that? Some people will. Some people will try it. Cities will try it for sure. The governor of California talking about his carbon trading system and wanting to talk to the world. It's a very good example of how you might do that kind of thing. You might see, London and New York have more in common with one another, perhaps financially, than does New York and Cincinnati. A friend of mine often says, I can see an economic case for New York being a nation, but I can't see an economic case for the United States being a nation often. It makes more sense as that unit, certainly does for London. I mean, as a British person myself, I'd say London could go anytime it wants, but it's because I'm from the north of England. But it opens that possibility. Will it deliver on that? As my friend here is saying, there's a lot of things we need to solve. But it's worth thinking about whether you can do that and what is the consequence of that. For if you're trying to cut a deal as a diplomat, and you've got a whole bunch of other people who are working at country deals that you can't get out of. We're always seeing how all this technology is, the internet, everything is pushing sub-state actors up. This is another technology that strengthens those sub-state actors, those super empowered individuals. And it's going to be used for good and for bad, I'm sure.
Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground tonight. So I hope all of you have a little bit better understanding of what blockchain is and some of the actual use cases that it's starting to be proved out in today, but understand that we're really at the genesis of this technology. It is very early days for blockchain, and people, there's a lot of noise around there with blockchain, and I always like to say the signal to noise ratio is still pretty small sometimes with blockchain, but there is a lot of unrealized potential to fundamentally change relationships and to change interactions and transactions between people, between organizations. So hopefully we've given you a lot of food for thought. I would like to give kind of 30 seconds to each of the panelists to just give their couple key takeaways that they hope you walk out of this room with tonight. Thomas?
For me, it's more of a plug-in. There is actually, one of the things I'm proud about the department is that for something that is so on the edge, it has actually, some of our bureaus have been very forthcoming in terms of trying to pilot some of these programs. So there is currently on grants.gov, I think, from our democracy and labor rights group, looking for ideas on how blockchain can help on labor rights and human rights issues around the world. So if you are a startup or an organization, an NGO who have some blockchain potential use cases for those type of spaces, please apply. I think the deadline is April 13th. It's coming up next week, I think, in a week or so. So please do apply. There is money. I think it's up to about $500,000, I think. So I just want to plug that in, and it's been real.
Great. Tori?
I just got to say, buckle up, because it's going to be a hell of a ride. This blockchain and the other fourth industrial revolution technologies are going to change the world. For old fox like myself who've lived through a lot of change, we ain't seen nothing yet. So let's try and push it towards the good this time.
Anil?
So I appreciate that both of my fellow panelists are such big thinkers and so positive about what the future is. Part of my job obviously is to look around corners to see what bus is about to hit you, right? So within that particular context, what I would like you to take away, if anything, is that yes, this is really interesting technology that is coming down the line. There is still a lot of rough edges, especially when it comes to the fact that if you want a truly competitive ecosystem that you can draw upon so that there is interoperable solutions, so that you're not locked into a particular way of, one true way from one particular company or whatever, you need to focus on what are the specifications and standards. And I'll reemphasize that basically, standards and specifications around decentralized identified, verifiable claims, and distributed key management are critical to scalable, interoperable global deployment of this technology. So I would continue to argue to participate in the standards organizations, make your voice known, and shape the standards so that they actually give you what you want.
Thank you. I hope all of you realize, this technology, it's a amazing, has amazing potential. It's a pretty complex technology. I think it's been seen throughout the conversation today that it can be deployed in a lot of different ways. And how you come about to how you're gonna create a blockchain and deploy it has real impacts on people and on people's lives. So we are so glad that you came out for this conversation tonight. We hope you continue the conversation with us, among yourselves, with your colleagues. And with that, I think we are a wrap.
That was amazing.